The war was over, but peace was a lie. It was 1945. The world had just emerged from the deadliest conflict in human history, World War II, and the Allies had triumphed. Hitler was dead, Europe lay in ruins, and in the glow of victory, a new darkness arose. Welcome to episode 6 of The Birth of a Nation. I'm your host, Johnny Young, and today we enter in an era of high-stakes diplomacy, espionage, paranoia, and protest, where nuclear shadow loomed over every conversation and freedom's meaning was questioned both abroad and at home. This is the Cold War and the Civil Rights era. Let's begin where peace ended, in the heart of destruction. August 6, 1945. The United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki. The mushroom cloud changed everything. Suddenly, America was the only nation in the world with the power to end it all, in minutes. But that power wouldn't go unmatched for long. By 1949, the Soviet Union had its own bomb. Two ideologies, capitalism and communism, stood on opposite sides of the globe, pointing weapons at each other and daring the other to blink. This wasn't a traditional war. It was fought in the shadows, with spies, secrets, and satellites. It was fought in Korea, in Vietnam, in Cuba, in the midst of everyday Americans. It was a war of fear. Unlike World War II, the Cold War had no front lines. No formal declarations of war. It was a geopolitical chess match between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Ideological rivalry, capitalism versus communism. Arms race, nuclear weapons and military buildup. Proxy wars, supporting opposite sides in regional conflicts. And the space race, who could reach the stars first? And beneath it all, a constant threat of global annihilation. In 1946, George Kennan, a U.S. diplomat in Moscow, penned a long telegram. His message? The Soviets were going to stop unless they were contained. This became the basis for the Truman Doctrine, America's policy to oppose communism expansion anywhere in the world. It was the opening move in a decades-long standoff. Back home, the Cold War took on a different form, fear of the enemy within. The Red Scare and Marxism arose in the early 1950s. Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed communists had infiltrated the U.S. government. Armed with little evidence but plenty of theatrics, he launched a witch hunt. Hollywood screenwriters, teachers, scientists, anyone could be accused. Lives were ruined on rumor alone. McCarthy's hearings were broadcast on national TV. For the first time, Americans saw how paranoia could become power and how dangerous it could be. Meanwhile, abroad, the lines were being drawn in blood. North Korea, backed by the Soviets and China, invaded South Korea. The U.S. and the United Nations forces intervened. The war seesawed across the 38th parallel. Millions died, and in the end, a stalemate. The war never officially ended. To this day, North and South Korea remain divided, a living reminder of Cold War tensions. But even as American soldiers fought overseas, a different kind of war brewed within, because the promise of democracy rang hollow for many Americans, especially Black Americans, who had fought for freedom abroad but faced segregation at home. Philip Randolph, a powerful Black labor and civil rights leader, threatened to march on Washington in 1941 to protest discrimination in the defense industry. FDR responded by banning racial discrimination in war jobs. and his activism laid the groundwork for what was to come. The contradiction was clear. How could America claim to lead the free world while denying freedom to millions of its own citizens? It was a question that would soon explode into a national reckoning. Schools defied, buses burned, dreams declared. The Cold War may have dominated headlines, but the civil rights movement was about to capture the heart of the nation. While America stared across oceans at foreign threats, a deeper struggle simmered in its own street. A war not of armies, but of conscience. A war not waged with tanks, but with lunch counters, buses, picket signs, and the indomitable will of a people demanding to be seen. This is the story of the civil rights movement, not as a series of headlines, but as a march of human courage, a defiance of resilience. Let's begin in 1954. The Brown v. Board of Education. In a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court declared that separate but equal had no place in public education. Segregated schools, long a pillar of Jim Crow, were deemed unconstitutional. It was a legal earthquake, and yet rulings on paper do not move hearts hardened by habit. Thurgood Marshall, the lead attorney for the NAACP in Brown v. Board, was a brilliant legal strategist. He later became the first black justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. But in the 1950s, he was a field general in the fight for equality, armed only with the law and a fierce intellect. After Brown, Southern states resisted, some violently. Enter 1957, the Little Rock Nine. 9 black students enrolled in Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. They were met with angry mobs and blocked by the governor's National Guard. President Eisenhower, a reluctant actor on civil rights, sent federal troops to escort them in. For the first time since Reconstruction, federal soldiers enforced civil rights in the South. The movement's strength lay in its discipline. Sit-ins, boycotts, freedom rides, civil disobedience in action. They weren't just spontaneous acts. They were orchestrated campaigns of nonviolent resistance, modeled in part after Gandhi's philosophy. Power met peace, and often cracked under the weight of his own cruelty. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama. Her arrest sparked a Montgomery bus boycott, a year-long protest that brought an unknown young pastor to national prominence. His name, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
King became the voice of a generation, preaching justice through peace, love, and pain. But he was not alone. Behind the scenes, Ella Baker empowered young leaders, and she helped birth the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, which would spearhead sit-ins, freedom rides, and voter registration in the Deep South. She famously said, "Strong people don't need strong leaders," and she built movements, not monuments. Let's move to 1963. Over 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial for the March on Washington. Black and white, young and old. It was a demand, not a celebration. Jobs, freedom, voting rights, equality, now. America's racial unrest was international news. The Soviet Union used photos of police brutality to undermine U.S. claims to moral superiority. Presidents knew civil rights weren't just a domestic issue, they were a global embarrassment. And still, the resistance met fire hoses with prayer. The Birmingham Campaign of 1963, organized by King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, Birmingham was ground zero. Police Chief Bull Connor unleashed dogs and water cannons on children, and the images shocked the world. From jail, King wrote his famous Letters from Birmingham Jail, a searing moral rebuke to white moderates who urged patience. Justice too long delayed is justice denied. John Lewis, a SNCC leader at just 23, helped lead the Selma to Montgomery marches. On the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Lewis and 600 marchers were met with clubs and tear gas. His skull was fractured, and the world was watching. President Lyndon Johnson, once a Southern segregationist, responded with urgency. The Civil Rights Acts banned discrimination in public places and employment, and the Voting Rights Acts protected black voters from suppression tactics. These laws were hard-won, paid for in blood and breath. But victory was not the end. While King preached integration, Malcolm X, once a Nation of Islam minister, advocated for self-defense and black nationalism. His voice was urgent, direct, and uncompromising. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. He was assassinated in 1965, but his influence endured. King was assassinated in 1968. Cities burned in grief and rage. The movement fractured into black power, economic justice campaigns, and student-led protests. But the echo remained. The civil rights movement was not a moment. It was, and still is, a movement. And though progress had come, the promise of equality still flickered on the horizon. The jungles of Southeast Asia were half a world away. But for an entire generation of America, Vietnam was everywhere. It was on the news, in the classroom, across dinner tables, and protest chants and folded flags. And it was a war that didn't just test American foreign policy, it tore at the soul of the nation. After World War II, the world wasn't just divided by borders, it was divided by ideology. Capitalism versus communism. The United States believed in containment, stopping the spread of communism at all costs. And when communist forces gained strength in North Vietnam, the logic of the Cold War kicked in. If Vietnam fell, others might follow. The infamous domino theory was born. The Gulf of Tonkin. In 1964, U.S. naval troops reported attacks by North Vietnamese boat. President Lyndon B. Johnson used this to push the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, granting him sweeping authority to escalate the war without an official declaration. What followed was one of the most decisive military campaigns in American history. By the late 1960s, more than 500,000 American troops are stationed in Vietnam, but the enemy was elusive. The terrain was brutal. The war had no front lines, and the U.S. military found itself bogged down in a conflict it could not define, let alone win. General William Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. forces in Vietnam, pushed for more troops, more bombing, more pressure. He assured the public victory is in sight. But what Americans saw on TV told a different story. Vietnam was beamed into American homes nightly, burning villages, body counts, soldiers questioning why they were there. Trust in the government began to erode, and fast. At home, the streets erupted. Protesters, many of them students, saw the war as unjust, imperialist, and unwinnable. The draft disproportionately targeted working class and minority youth. College campuses became war zones of their own. In 1970, at Kent State University, National Guardsmen opened fire on student protests. 4 were killed. And Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion, refused to be drafted. He said, "I ain't got no quarrel with Viet Cong." And Ali was stripped of his titles, barred from boxing, but became a symbol of resistance. In 1968, the Tet Offensive rocked the country. A coordinated North Vietnamese assault on dozens of South Vietnamese cities during a holiday ceasefire. U.S. forces repelled the attacks, but the shock was psychological. Americans were told the enemy was weakening. Tet proved otherwise. Support for the war collapsed. The Pentagon Papers, leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, these classified documents revealed that multiple administrations had misled the public about the war's progress and intentions. Trust in the government hit a historic low. The most trusted news anchor in America, Walter Cronkite, after visiting Vietnam, told viewers, "To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, yet unsatisfactory conclusion." President Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Eventually, the cost became unbearable. 58,000 Americans killed, hundreds of thousands wounded, millions of Vietnamese civilian and soldiers dead. In 1973, the U.S. forces withdrew. 2 years later, Saigon fell. Vietnam was unified under communist rule, but the war left lasting scars. Veterans returned to a divided, often ungrateful nation. PTSD was widespread but barely acknowledged, and the U.S. military lost public trust. Vietnam was more than a war. It was a reckoning of truth, power, patriotism, and pain. It shattered illusions. It questioned morality. It forced Americans to ask, what does it mean to fight for freedom abroad while denying it at home? The war was over, at least in Vietnam. But in Washington, a different kind of war was being waged, not with bullets, but with microphones, wiretaps, leaked memos, and a growing sense that those in power were no longer serving the people, but themselves. The 1970s would reveal the crack in America's foundation and spark movements that would demand to rebuild it. In June 17, 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. At first, it seemed minor, a political burglary. But 2 journalists at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, began to peel back the layers. What they uncovered was staggering: wiretapping, sabotage, payoffs, and a cover-up that stretched to the Oval Office. We all know it as the Watergate scandal. Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, brilliant, paranoid, driven, had won re-election in a landslide in 1972, but the scandal metastasized. Secret tapes, obstruction of justice, the infamous smoking gun tape revealed Nixon had ordered the CIA to shut down the FBI's investigation. Facing impeachment, Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974, the first U.S. president ever to do so. The Watergate scandal didn't just bring down a presidency, it brought down trust. Americans had already been disillusioned by Vietnam. Now they questioned their leaders, their institutions, even the idea of American exceptionalism. Watergate transformed the media. Investigative journalism became a cornerstone of democracy, the so-called Fourth Estate, checking the other three branches. The phrase "follow the money" became a battle cry, and Americans learned a hard truth. Sometimes, patriotism means holding power accountable. But even as political world unraveled, another revolution was unfolding in kitchens, offices, and courtrooms. Gloria Steinem, journalist, activist, feminist icon, with her trademark glasses and cutting wit, Steinem helped lead the modern women's liberation movement. She co-founded Miss Magazine, took on taboos like domestic violence and reproductive rights, and became the public face of a rising tide of women demanding equality. The Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, first proposed in 1923, gained massive momentum in the 1970s. It stated simply, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied on account of sex. By 1977, 35 states had ratified it, just 3 short of the 38 needed. But opposition, led by conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly, framed it as an attack on traditional values. The ERA stalled and expired. The 1970s were complicated. They were a time of polyester and protests, of disco balls and distrust. New voices were rising: women, people of color, LGBTQ activists, environmentalists. In Roe v. Wade, a landmark decision, the Supreme Court ruled that women had a constitutional right to an abortion. It galvanized the feminist movement and ignited fierce backlash. The ruling became a flashpoint in the so-called culture wars that would define American politics for decades. Cesar Chavez, a child of migrant farm workers, co-founded the United Farm Workers Union. He led strikes and boycotts for better wages and humane treatment, most famously the Delano Grape Strike. His weapon, nonviolence. His rallying cry, "Si se puede," yes we can. This era also marked a rising environmental consciousness. The first Earth Day, 1970, over 20 million Americans participated in rallies, cleanups, and teach-ins demanding action on pollution, conservation, and public health. The Environmental Protection Agency was born that same year. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and Endangered Species Act followed, shaping how Americans live with their land and air. In 1973, OPEC nations cut off oil exports to the U.S., triggering gas shortages, long lines at pumps, and a realization America's prosperity was tied to global instability. For the first time, energy independence became a national concern. But for the challenges, inequalities persisted, especially in urban black communities. Police brutality, housing discrimination, and economic injustice fueled anger. The Black Panther Party, founded in 1966, The Panthers believed in self-defense, community programs, and confronting systemic racism head-on. They started free breakfast programs for children. They monitored police. They were surveilled and targeted by the FBI. To some, they were heroes. To others, a threat. COINTELPRO, the FBI secret program to infiltrate and disrupt activist groups, from the Panthers to the American Indian movement to anti-war organizations. Led by J. Edgar Hoover, COINTELPRO used surveillance, propaganda, and intimidation. The goal: protect the status quo. The cost: trust in civil liberties. By the end of the 1970s, America was exhausted. Nixon was gone. The economy was reeling. The country had weathered war, scandal, protests, and upheaval. But it had also changed permanently. The 1980s dawned with inflation, gas lines, and a wounded national psyche. But one man promised something different: a new beginning, a rebirth of strength, a return to greatness. It was his campaign declared Morning in America. Ronald Reagan, actor, governor, 40th President of the United States, Reagan embodied optimism and confidence, but also ignited fierce debates over the role of government. His brand of conservatism championed lower taxes, deregulation, and increased military spending. To supporters, he was a visionary. To critics, a smiling face on widening inequality. Reaganomics, the economic doctrine of the decade, was built on the idea that cutting taxes on the wealthy and businesses would lead to investment, job creation, and eventual benefits for all. Trickle-down economics, so called it, skeptically. Corporate profits soared, so did the national debt, and the gap between rich and poor widened dramatically. The Reagan era brought sweeping deregulation in banking, telecommunications, and environmental protections. It also coincided with a surge in pop culture influence. MTV launched. Blockbusters like E.T. and Top Gun lit up screens. Wall Street became a symbol of both success and excess. The 80s were a paradox, boomy and brittle. But Reagan's legacy is inseparable from one towering conflict: the Cold War. In 1983, Reagan labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire. Tensions soared. Nuclear war drills resumed. Missile defense programs like Star Wars were announced. The arms race accelerated. But behind the scenes, a thaw had begun. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet premier with a birthmark and bold ideas, Gorbachev introduced glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring, reforms meant to revitalize the Soviet economy and promote transparency. But they also unleashed forces he couldn't control. 1987, Berlin. Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate and issued a challenge that would echo throughout the history. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Just 2 years later, the wall did fall. In a single day, the symbol of division crumpled. East and West Berlin embraced. Hammers chipped at concrete. The Iron Curtain lifted. The Cold War was ending. By 1991, USSR collapsed. Soviet republics declared independence. Communist rule unraveled. And on Christmas Day, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. The United stood alone, the world's lone superpower. Victory? Perhaps, but not without scars. The end of the Cold War brought relief and uncertainty. America had won the geopolitical chess match, but at home, battles still raged. As the AIDS epidemic spread throughout the 1980s, government response lagged. Activist groups like ACT UP demanded action, funding, and compassion. By 1990, over 100,000 Americans had died. The crisis galvanized a generation of advocates, fighting not only a virus, but also stigma and silence. Reagan's administration launched the crackdown on drugs with mandatory minimums and aggressive policing. Cocaine and crack devastated urban communities. Mass incarceration rates surged, especially for Black and Latino Americans. Critics argue the war on drugs fueled systemic injustice that still echoes today. And just as one war ended, another revolution began, the digital age. The first personal computers appeared on desks. Apple and IBM raced to reimagine the future. And in basements and boardrooms, the seeds of the internet were quietly taking root. The 1990s were coming, with new challenges, new possibilities, and a new chapter in America's history. From post-war boom to civil rights marches, from Watergate to Reaganomics, from nuclear threats to digital dreams, this era redefined what it meant to be an American. We were a nation constantly transforming, sometimes painfully, sometimes triumphantly, but always moving forward. I'm Johnny Young, and this is how the past still powers the present.
If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, and share the podcast with others who love history and global stories. Got a correction, a suggestion, or a country you'd like featured? Reach out. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, every nation has a story worth telling.